Are books worth killing for? In the old world sanctuary of the British Museum reading room, where scholars turn yellow pages in hushed reverence, a murder shatters the silence. An elderly professor is found dead. But who is his killer? The truth lies buried in papers and scholarly magazines. Mrs. Craggs, a humble charwoman overlooked by those of lofty intellect, notices what others miss. As ambition ruffles the scholarly calm, she must uncover the truth that is hidden in plain sight. My name is Tony Walker, narrator of the Classic Detective Stories podcast, and I invite you to listen to A Dangerous Thing by H.R.F. Keating. A Dangerous Thing by H.R.F. Keating. There are places in London into which it is not given to everyone to enter. Yet one of these, a holy of holies, Mrs. Craggs' daily cleaner, was an habituée. This was the reading room at the British Museum Library, to which entry is restricted to approved scholars only. But it was as well that Mrs. Craggs' duties took her in there too. Definitely as well. Of course, she saw little of the reading room while it was properly in use, when the readers were there deep in volumes from that huge collection, to which by law every single book, magazine, fascicle or pamphlet published in Great Britain must be sent. But she liked the stately quiet atmosphere of the huge round chamber, under its shallow glass dome, as she polished its great floor early in the mornings before the hour of opening. She liked the encircling shelves of leather-smelling tomes, the British Union Catalogue of Periodicals, the Bibliothèque Nationale Catalogue des Imprimes, the Cumulative Book Index, the Annual Register, the Calendars of State Papers, Halsbury's Statutes of England, Notes and Queries, and the long run of the Gentleman's Magazine. And she very much liked what she saw of the learned people who began to come in at 9:30 a.m. There might not be, she would often think, any great sheikhs as specimens of physical beauty, running as they did for the most part to shoulders stooped and rounded by long hours bent over volumes laid out on desks, and to posteriors more adapted to the seated attitude than to the soldierly march or the elegance of the dance. But, by and large, the love of their work, the love of scholarship for the sake of scholarship, shone in their eyes, gleamed clearly through spectacle lenses often neglectfully smeared. And Mrs. Craggs, though she was the first to acknowledge that she was not much of a reader herself, loved them for that. Not that she loved every single one she chanced to see after her chief duty of polishing that enormous circular floor with its radiating spokes of readers' desks was over, and she was preoccupied in seeing to parts of the huge learning machine not open to the public, even to that privileged section in possession of readers' admission tickets. There were a few individuals she had picked out as being, for all their industry at their desks, not proper scholars, not people dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake. Most of these whizzers, as Mrs. Craggs called them in her own mind, were comparatively young, though they were not all necessarily so. And she would have had difficulty, had she been asked, in saying just what it was about them that marked them out for her. Perhaps it was the way they always hurried. They hurried to be first in the short queues waiting to hand in book application slips at the small circular area that forms the hub of the room's great wheel. They hurried, first thing in the morning, to occupy some particular one of the 390 blue leather-covered desks which they considered to be nearest the particular reference works on the room's perimeter that they might need. They hurried, when closing time came, to be first in the queues to hand back books for the safekeeping during the night. Whizzers was Mrs. Craggs' name for them, and in her eyes they spoilt the slow, quiet, studious atmosphere of the place, much as a garish, half-squashed Coke can spoils the beauty of some ancient, close-mown lawn onto which it has been carelessly thrown. Once she overheard one of her gentlemen, one of the ones who was certainly not a whizzer, quoting a couple lines of poetry to himself as he toddled away to get some lunch at midday. "A little learning is a dangerous thing. Drink deep or taste not the Pierian spring." She had often wondered what the heck a Pierian spring was, but she had no difficulty in at once agreeing with the bit about a little learning. It was a dangerous thing. She knew that in her bones, and it was the whizzers who had it, and would be dangerous some day to someone, somewhere. Before long, there came a time when she had startling proof of this. It was on a day that began no differently from any other, except for one funny thing. Mrs. Craggs had been standing at the entrance of the reading room in the lofty inner hall of the vast museum itself, talking to a friend of hers, one of the warders who check people going in to make sure they are in possession of a reader's ticket. It was a slack time, shortly after the first small rush of readers when the museum opens, and Mr. Micklejohn, a Scot who had lost none of his Scottishness for a long residence in London, had been glad of a few moments' chat. They had just got on to the subject of whizzers, though Mrs. Craggs was keeping her pet name for them to herself, and Mr. Micklejohn, who was a pretty formidable scholar himself, if the faces of readers, past, present, long-term, and temporary, is a subject for scholarship, was agreeing that there were bodies you can pick out, were never your regular reader the way a reader ought to be, when a very, very elderly man came slowly up to the entrance. He looked, thought Mrs. Craggs, about as old as anybody could be. He had a little stooped, frail body that shuffled forwards under an enormous old overcoat, despite the summer heat, like a tortoise in its shell. His head, on which a few white hairs were spread this way and that, poked out on the end of a scrawny, thin length of neck, round which an old grey woolen muffler was wrapped, and he surveyed the world cautiously through a pair of tiny, glinting, pince-nez spectacles. Mr. Micklejohn stepped forward and asked with grave Scottish courtesy if he could see his reader's ticket. "Reader's ticket?" said the old gentleman, as if such an object were something he had once heard of, dimly. "Reader's ticket? Well, yes, I suppose I have a reader's ticket. Must have been given one when I first used the library in 99. I think that must have been 99 or 98. Can't quite remember." Mr. Micklejohn shot Mrs. Craggs a quick glance of amazement. Could the old boy really be meaning that he had first come to the reading room in the year 1899? Or even 1898? 80 years ago? Was it possible? And Mrs. Craggs, looking at that peering, scaly tortoise head on its long, thin, desiccated, scarf-wound neck, thought that, well, might be. It might really be. It would make the old boy probably 100 years old. A bit less if he'd begun to come to the reading room as a bright lad of 18 or 19, but anyhow, within a few months of his century. And he looked old enough to be a centenarian, every bit. "Have you got your ticket on you now, sir, eh?" Mr. Micklejohn asked, pitching his voice a wee bit loudly, in case the old gentleman was hard of hearing. "On me? Now, might have, suppose. I might have, somewhere. Why on earth do you want to know?" Mr. Micklejohn strove not to allow too astonished a look appear on his features. "We have to examine readers' tickets now, sir," he said. "It's a regulation. Has been for a good many years, sir, eh?" I see. Unauthorized fellas trying to make their way inside, eh?" "Something like that, sir. And there have been thefts, sir, I'm sorry to say." "Thefts? Thefts, eh? What is the world coming to, when a scholar and gentleman will steal from his own library? It's a terrible thing, sir. A terrible thing. But I'm afraid it means I'll have to see your ticket, sir, eh? Oh, of course. Of course. The old gentleman brought one rather trembly grey woolen gloved hand to join the other, and with extreme slowness plucked off the right-hand glove. He then seemed in some doubt about what to do with it. "Might I hold that for you, sir?" asked Mr. Micklejohn. Oh, yes, yes. Good of you." Mr. Micklejohn secured the grey glove. The tips of its fingers had been carefully darned once, many years ago, and the old gentleman plunged his free hand into the recesses of his overcoat. A sudden rattling noise, like a quick burst of fire from a Kalashnikov automatic rifle, came from just behind them. Mrs. Craggs and Mr. Micklejohn looked round. It was a reader wanting to enter and coughing to draw attention to his need. And in that one quick half-second glance, Mrs. Craggs put him down at once as a whizzer. A whizzer, plainly in a fury because he was being held up from plunging into the reading room and his waiting books. "One moment, if you please, Mr. Tipton Martin," said Mr. Micklejohn, authority on readers' faces. Mr. Tipton Martin, who was about 24 or 25, with a slightly fat face, and pale, well-brushed hair, wearing not the neglected clothes that most readers seem to possess, but a well-pressed light blue safari suit, with a shirt in broad blue and white stripes to match, gave Mr. Micklejohn a glance of suppressed rage. But there was nothing he could do about getting through the narrow entrance to the reading room before the old gentleman. For perhaps as much as a minute or more, the latter fished waveringly inside his overcoat. But then his hand emerged gripping a time-polished leather wallet. With trembling fingers, rather hampered by the grey glove still on his other hand, he attempted to pull out from it a small card that once might have been white, but was now grey with age. "Should I give you a hand, sir?" asked Mr. Micklejohn. Behind the old gentleman, young Mr. Tipton Martin produced a snort of quick disgust. "That's very good of you," said the old gentleman, handing over the wallet. Mr. Micklejohn deftly extracted the card and gave it a glance. "Mr. Walter Grappelin," he read. "Thank you, sir." He was about to slip the card back into the old gentleman's wallet when he suddenly stopped and gave it another scrutiny. "I'm very sorry, sir," he said, "but this ticket's out of date. It doesn't appear to have been renewed since—" He stopped, and then continued in a voice from which he strove to eliminate the incredulity. "Since 1943, sir." "Yes," said old Mr. Grappelin. "Yes, that would be right. I suppose it must have been a year or so after that I had last occasion to use the library. Just about the time of the end of the Second World War, the one with that chap Hitler, you know. I retired from my editorship about then, and the Bodleian at Oxford has been sufficient for my needs up till now. But I found yesterday that I really ought to look up that novel of George Sand that was suppressed, you know, and the Bodleian hasn't a copy. So I thought I'd better come up here." "Quite so, sir," said Mr. Micklejohn reassuringly, "but I'm afraid you really will have to get your ticket renewed. The office is just by the main entrance doors down there, sir, round to your right." "Ah, good. Thank you. Thank you." And the old man shuffled away, moving not much faster than the tortoise he so much resembled. "Your ticket, Mr. Tipton Martin, then," Mr. Micklejohn said briskly. Ticket. Oh, yes, my ticket." Young safari-suited Mr. Tipton Martin seemed not at all his usual whizzing self. Mrs. Craggs wondered why. And for once, her curiosity was satisfied. Instead of shooting into the reading room and zipping round to secure himself some particularly advantageous desk, Mr. Tipton Martin stayed where he was, and actually began to gossip with Mr. Micklejohn. To gossip. There was, thought Mrs. Craggs, no other word for it. "Do you know who that was?" he asked the warder. "Gentleman name of Grappelin, sir. Yes, but he's no ordinary gentleman. He's Professor Walter Grappling, you know, the editor of the Oxford Dictionary of 19th Century French, one of the great works of scholarship of our time. I thought he was dead years ago. The dictionary came out in 1945 and he was quite old then. He retired as soon as he'd seen it through the press. He must be damn near 100 now. A very remarkable man, sir, eh? Said Mr. Micklejohn in suitably awed tones. Very remarkable indeed. Mr. Tipton Martin laughed. It was an unexpected sound. Mrs. Craggs reckoned that whizzers didn't often laugh. But then this seemed to be a day of unexpected events. You may say old Walter Grappling's remarkable, Mr. Tipton Martin said, but he wasn't half as remarkable as his younger brother. Indeed not, sir. Then young Mr. Grappling must have been very, very remarkable. He was a poet, you know. Mr. Micklejohn shook his head. I'm no very much what you'd call a poetry man myself, sir, he said. No? I should have thought that everyone had heard of Maurice Grappling. After all, next to Rupert Brooke, he was probably our finest poet of the 1418 war. Indeed, sir. Well, now, that's very interesting. That's as may be, said Mr. Tipton Martin a little sharply, but the poetry is by no means the most interesting thing about Maurice Grappling. Not many people remember this or even know it, but he wasn't only a poet. He was a remarkable scholar as well, a philologist, of course, in the family tradition, following his elder brother's footsteps. But if you ask me, he'd have far outshone him, if he lived, if his discoveries in the field of... but never mind, you'd hardly understand. The poor gentleman died early then, sir? Mr. Micklejohn asked with undeterred sympathy. Died early? Mr. Tipton Martin said. Why, he was killed, man. Killed in 1914. Didn't you even know that? I'm afraid not, sir, Mr. Micklejohn said. He sounded thoroughly ashamed of his ignorance, and Mrs. Craggs, who in the ordinary way would not have ventured to address a reader, quite suddenly jumped into the conversation in his defence. And how come you know such a lot about his philosopher what's-it and all that? She asked, politeness abandoned. Mr. Tipton Martin looked utterly affronted, as perhaps he had reason to be, suddenly spoken to by a person in a flowered apron with a rather squashed-looking red hat on her head. As a matter of fact, he said, chilliness in every word, I work in the same discipline myself, and I was also privileged as an undergraduate to recatalogue the library at Castle Mandeville, a task which had been abandoned by none other than the young Maurice Grappling at the outbreak of the 1914-18 war, so naturally I know something of the man, perhaps rather more than any other scholar in the field. And with that, he turned on his heel and flounced into the reading-room, omitting to show Mr. Micklejohn his reader's ticket. But Mr. Micklejohn was unperturbed. He shook his head wonderingly. Losh, he said, it's always amazing to me just how much a real scholar knows, eh? Mrs. Craggs sniffed. Real scholar, she said. Oh, come now, Mrs. Craggs. The wee man's been spoken of as one of the rising people. There was a gentleman the other day who told me that when next month a certain learned journal comes out, it's to have an article in it by the young man that's likely to astonish everybody in the field and make his name for him once and for all. Not that anyone else will ken what's all about, mind, but in his wee world, he's fair bent to be a kingpin. That's as may be, Mrs. Craggs said, not at all impressed by this example of a whizzer whizzing, but all the same. He only knew all about that Maurice Grappling 'cause he happened to have had a job in the self-same place where the fellow worked before he went off and got shot for his country. I don't see what's so ruddy amazing about that. The next thing that happened on this day, which was to turn out to be extraordinary in every way, was that Mrs. Milhorn lost her handbag. Mrs. Milhorn, long Mrs. Craggs's friend, different in so many ways though they were, liked to work in the same place if she could, and she had been a cleaner in the reading-room almost as long as Mrs. Craggs. But her view of the readers was not at all the same as her friends. She regarded them all, scholars and whizzers alike, as creatures of an extraordinary superior order, as not so much human beings with human beings' imperfections and weaknesses, as walking brains, beyond and above ordinary ways, as the stars are above the humdrum earth. So, naturally, when she realized she had left her handbag tucked into one of the knee-hole shelves at desk number F8 when she had dusted it that morning, dusting was her forte, just as good hard floor polishing was Mrs. Craggs. She felt entirely incapable of simply going quietly into the reading room and retrieving it. "I'd disturb them," she said to Mrs. Craggs, much as she might have been saying, "I'd assassinate them. I couldn't do it. I couldn't. Me nerves would go to pieces. I just could not set foot in that room. Then you'll have to manage without your old bag. But I must have it. I must. It's got me pills in it. I need them pills. One every 4 hours I've got to take. Your doctor said so. Then go in and fetch it. I couldn't. I can't. But I must have it. Must." Mrs. Craggs sighed. She had known from the start what would happen in the end. "All right," she said, "I'll go." And into the reading room with its ranks of bowed, studious heads she went, walking quietly as she could, but unable, of course, to do anything about her shoes, which squeaked abominably, nor was had. But only one person took any notice, and that was a whizzer, one of the female variety, a lady dressed in a severe grey suit with a pointed nose and heavy purple-rimmed spectacles. She hissed at Mrs. Craggs like an affronted goose, but otherwise nothing stopped her making her way between the radiating spokes of face-to-face desks and their high separating partitions until she got to number F8. She recognized at once its occupant. It was the old man, Professor Grappelin. He must have succeeded in renewing his reader's ticket without any trouble, she thought, and here he was now, sitting patiently at his desk, waiting for that book he wanted to come from where it must lie in the deep underground bookstore among the rows on rows of close-packed volumes. Or rather, Mrs. Craggs thought, he ain't so much waiting as having a nice bit of a ziz till his book comes. He had, she saw, been reading a magazine, one of them magazines that the learned gents of the reading room was always reading. She could see its title, The Journal of Philological Studies, whatever philological meant, and she could see the date on it too, today's date. The old boy still keeping up with all the latest, even if it was damn nearly 100 years old. She decided that she could probably rescue Mrs. Milhorn's handbag from the knee-hole shelf without disturbing the old boy. And she would have succeeded in doing so too. Only, just as she stooped to reach in beside the old chap's unmoving little frail body, a crumpled piece of paper that someone had dropped on the floor just under the desk caught her eye. Tidying up was a discipline to Mrs. Craggs. If there was dirt or mess about her, she could no more stop herself dealing with it than she could have stopped herself breathing. So she reached down and picked up the piece of paper. It was a sheet of plain paper, very stiff and just lightly squeezed together, and thrust it into the pocket in front of her flowered apron with the intention of popping it into a waste-paper basket as soon as she'd got out of the quietly calm atmosphere of the reading room. But in reaching just a little further than she had meant to, so as to get hold of that piece of rubbish, the edge of her shoulder had lightly brushed against the sleeping professor's jutting-out elbow, and when it did so, the old man, his body weighing hardly more than that of any lucky little girl's giant doll, toppled over out of his chair to lie, just in the position he had been in, curled up on the floor. Mrs. Craggs gasped, and then she gave a little, short, sharp, involuntary scream. Because, as the old man had fallen, his long grey muffler had come away, and looking down, Mrs. Craggs' eyes had been drawn as if by two tugging black threads to the handle of a small shining silver paper knife that was protruding from the back of that frail old tortoise neck. Mrs. Craggs had recovered herself in a moment and had gone straight along to the central round desk to report the murder, all the more disturbed because of the nagging feeling at the back of her mind that somewhere before she had seen the murder weapon, that little silver paper knife. Its handle was funny. in the shape of a stubby, short-armed cross. She'd seen that before somewhere. Couldn't mistake it. Just as she was about to report, she noticed a yard or two further round the counter young Mr. Tipton Martin, standing, waiting to hand back books he had finished with. So, remembering that he had known who old Professor Grapplin was, she went round, took him by the elbow and marched him back, despite his initial protests, to help her tell the story. It was a good thing she'd done so, because once a police constable had been summoned from the courtyard outside the museum, Mr. Tipton Martin was able to advance matters in a decidedly swift way. Or so it seemed. "Constable," he said, when things had begun to be sorted out a little, and they were waiting for the full might of Scotland Yard to arrive, "there's something I think you ought to know." "Oh, yes, sir." "I hesitate to tell you because it may seem like launching an accusation against a person who may be perfectly innocent. But on the other hand, he is still here, and—" "Who is this, sir?" the constable asked with some urgency. Mr. Tipton Martin pulled at the corners of the collar of his smart blue and white striped shirt. "It's Francis Lecroix," he said. "I don't suppose you'll have ever heard of him, officer, but he's quite well known in his field, in a way. He's a philologist, or he was. Well, he almost certainly thinks of himself as one." "I'm sorry, sir," said the constable, "but I don't quite see what you're getting at." No, I'm sorry. Well, you see, it's quite simple, really. Lecroix, years ago, was one of Professor Grapplin's assistants on his great work, the Oxford Dictionary of 19th Century French, but he quarrelled with him. It was a professional disagreement over the definition of a certain group of words, and he resigned. And then, I'm afraid, he never got another job in the academic world. People thought he wasn't sound, you know. But he still persisted with his notion that Professor Grapplin had committed a serious crime in compiling that section of the dictionary. He became obsessed with the idea. He even wrote a little book to explain his theories, and he had it privately printed and sent copies to every philologist of note. It's very well known in its way, a sort of joke. Because, you see, the chap is mad, of course. Mad as a hatter. But he happens to be here in the reading room now. And it was today that Professor Grapplin suddenly surfaced here, when everybody thought he must be dead long ago. "I see, sir," said the constable. "And just where is this other gentleman now, this Mr. Lecroix, was it?" "He's there, officer. Just there." And Mr. Tipton Martin extended a long arm and pointed right over to a far corner, near desk P9. Mrs. Craggs, who, like everyone else, had followed that long pointing arm, felt a sudden thump of dismay, somewhere in the region of her heart, because she recognized the man Mr. Tipton Martin had named. He was the old scholar she had once heard muttering to himself that a little learning is a dangerous thing, and worse, the moment she saw him, she knew where it was that she had seen that silver paper knife with the stubby cross handle. She had seen it more than once, on whatever desk it had been that Francis Lecroix was occupying. He always had it with him. He was always reading those old books that had uncut pages, and he used the knife constantly to open them up. Of course, the constable had gone straight over and asked old Francis Lecroix. He must be 75 if he's a day, Mrs. Craggs thought, to step over this way if he would. And there he had been by the central desk, when from Scotland Yard, to take charge of the inquiry, there had arrived, with an impressive escort of detective sergeants and fingerprint men and photographers and a scene of crime officer, the great towering form of Superintendent Mouse. Mrs. Craggs recognised him from his photo in the papers, that slab-sided, 6'6" body, that solid wall of a face. But what she had never seen in the papers was what Superintendent Mouse pulled from the top pocket of his tent-like grey suit when Mr. Tipton Martin repeated his account of old Professor Grapplin, the Oxford Dictionary of 19th Century French, and Monsieur Lecroix, a pair of heavy horn-rim spectacles. He put them on the bridge of his massive squabby nose and peered through them at little safari-suited Mr. Tipton Martin. He said, The ODNCF, eh? Masterly piece of work, of course. I do a little reading on those lines myself from time to time. I couldn't do without it. Mr. Tipton Martin positively preened himself. Then perhaps you'll know that little book, the great Oxford Dictionary of the 19th Century French Scandal, Lecoir's polemic, he said. Yes, an interesting piece of work, in its way. But the work of... Mr. Tipton Martin dropped his voice, since old Francois Lecoir was, after all, standing there, blinking from one to the other. A total lunatic. Oh, yes, undoubtedly. Lunatic, yes, lunatic. Superintendent Mouse removed his heavy horn rims and tucked them decisively into his top pocket. Well, thank you, Mr. Tupton Marlowe, he said. And now, I think, Mr. Lecoir, if you'll accompany me to Scotland Yard, we can have this business cleared up before very much longer. Oh, no, you don't, said Mrs. Craggs. She was surprised, really, to hear her own voice, right out loud like that, in the tremendous hush that had fallen on the wide-domed reading room after the first excitement had died down. But she had spoken. The words had been forced from her somehow, and she was glad that they had. But everyone was looking at her now. Superintendent Mouse's ham-like left hand was groping again for his horn rims. She had to justify what she'd said. Look, she began, you can't take him away like that. Well, there ain't no need to. Superintendent Mouse dropped his horn rims, which he had got halfway out of his top pocket, back in. Plainly, this was not a matter where the more intellectual side of life could be called into play. You're the lady who found the body, he pronounced. Cleaning woman, isn't it? Mrs. Bloggs, I believe? If you believe that, you'll believe anything that likes to come into your head, Mrs. Craggs retorted. No, my name's Craggs, and always has been ever since we was united more years ago than I cares to remember. And if you believe a gentleman like old Mr. Lecoir here, what I calls a real scholar, could have done what was done to that poor old professor, then you're worse than what I thought. Superintendent Mouse drew himself up to his full 6'6". The breadth of his body was enormous. That's quite enough of that, he said. When I want a charwoman to tell me who's a scholar and who isn't, I'll sell every book in my library. I dare say Mr. Lecoir here looks like a scholar to you. Clothes he hasn't changed for the best part of 6 months, and spectacles with that left lens cracked. But that doesn't make him any different from any other person or persons, and he's got a little bit of explaining to do back at the yard. He turned his massive bulk to face the aged author of the great Oxford Dictionary of 19th Century French Scandal, who did indeed look a dusty and neglected figure. Now, just you come along with me, he said. But Mrs. Craggs thrust herself, flowered apron, squashed red hat, between the superintendent and his prey. He ain't going, she said. How she brought herself to say it, she never knew. He ain't going, or not until you've listened to reason for half a minute. My good woman. Don't you good woman me. Just you listen. Mr. Lacroix is a scholar. Ain't I seen him in here day after day, nose down in these old books of his, cutting away at every single page has been stuck together ever since the book was printed and nobody else cared what was inside? But Superintendent Mouse's massive face has suddenly lit up with an inner fire. Cutting away at uncut pages, he said. And what was he using to do that? Come along, speak up. It was then that Mrs. Craggs thought that all she had done was to make matters worse for her nice old gentleman. But it was his knife that was still sticking deep into the frail neck of old Professor Grappelin, and she knew it was. And not telling the truth wasn't going to make matters one bit better for anyone. So she told the truth. And Superintendent Mouse put on his heavy horn rims and went over and gave the shiny silver handle of the paper knife a short personal examination. Then he returned to the central desk, where the group of them were still standing. Yes, he said. Well, come along now, Mr. Lacroix. Mrs. Craggs felt terrible. She knew that old Mr. Lacroix, the man who could toddle out of the reading room muttering, "A little learning is a dangerous thing," for all that he might have had a bit of a bee in his bonnet about some complicated bit of studying in that huge big dictionary they were all on about, could not have plunged his paper knife into the old professor's neck and then covered up its jutting silver handle with the grey muffler. He could not have done that. It wasn't right for a man like him. But how had his knife, his very own knife, in the form of a cross, that she herself had seen him with so often, how could that knife have got to have been used for the horrible purpose that it had, if he was not the person who had used it? And then she knew. It came to her in a flash. Nah, old Mr. LaCroix, the real scholar, didn't use that knife. It had been used by none other than Mr. Tipton Martin, whizzer. She realised that not only did she know this, but she knew why Mr. Tipton Martin had done what he had done. No wonder he had gabbled and gabbled on like that after the sudden appearance of the old professor, when everyone had thought he was long ago dead. Professor Walter Grappling, whose brother had been Maurice Grappling, the poet who had been tragically killed in 1914. The poet and the philol what's-it. A philol what's-it, like Mr. Tipton Martin himself. Mr. Tipton Martin, who had once worked in a library somewhere, where Mr. Maurice Grappling had been working till he dropped everything to go and fight in the war, had left behind, she knew this to be true, as she had seen the evidence with her own eyes, some discovery or other in philol what's-it that young Mr. Tipton Martin years later had found, and had pinched, safe in the knowledge that no one would know that Maurice Grappling had done the work before him. Only, what was more likely than Walter Grappling would recognise his brilliant young brother's work when just next month it came out in the Journal of Philol Thingame-Bob Studies, the very magazine the old man had been reading this morning's copy of just before he'd fallen asleep at his desk over there. And young whizzer Tipton Martin had realised his danger, and then had realised that the perfect scapegoat for the murderer that would get him out of trouble and let him whiz on up to being kingpin of philol what's-it was there in the reading room, asking to be made use of, even down to providing him with a weapon that would point back to its owner like a ruddy, illuminated street sign. But how was she to prove all this? How was she to convince Superintendent Mass, when plainly he had lapped up every word that this fella, so-called scholar, young Safari Suit, had ladled out to him? Old Mr. LaCroix had said hardly a word up till now. He had agreed that he was who he was, but beyond that he'd kept silent, looking from face to face as each development occurred. But now he spoke. Grappling was wilfully mistaken over the vocabulary of the midinette, he said. Wilfully, you know. You've only to read my book to see why. But I wouldn't have wished him any harm. There, said Mrs. Craggs. There, you see, mild as Dutch cheese. How can you say he'd have done a thing like that? Mrs. Bloggs, said Superintendent Mouse, I should be reluctant to have you charged with obstruction, but, believe me, I shall, if you persist in this. His huge left hand reached up to his horn rims as if he would like just to pursue the relevant section of the Act before instituting proceedings. It's now or never, thought Mrs. Craggs. Whatever shall I do? And then, as if the spirit of Athene, goddess of wisdom, had descended on her from the great domed roof above, the answer came to her. She had it. She had had it all along. So now she produced it. It came out of her pocket, out of the pocket of her flowered apron, a piece of crumpled paper, a stiff, lightly crumpled sheet of paper. Look, she said, just you look at this, and you see. So charged were her words that Superintendent Mouse, manoeuvring his huge bulk round in the direction of the reader's entrance and extending a ham fist in the direction of old Mr. Lacroix's elbow, stopped and swung himself back round again. Look at what? He demanded. Look at this piece of paper what I picked up just under old Professor Grappling's desk, Mrs. Craggs said. Get your old horn rims out, mate, and have a gander at this. Look, a piece of paper, stiff paper, what's been wrapped round something, ain't it? Superintendent Mouse, who, to do him justice, had ignored the word mate and had got out his horn rims and settled them across the bridge of his great squabby nose, peered and agreed. Yes, stiff paper and wrapped around an object. "And you know why, don't ya?" said Mrs. Craggs. "Fingerprints, that's why. Well, if someone has to keep his fingerprints off of that there paper knife, it can only have been 'cause it wasn't the chap who owned the knife what used it. Everyone knew it was old Mr. LaCroix's knife, so there wouldn't have been no point in him keeping his paw marks off it, would it? And look, you can see the print of that there cross handle on the paper, can't ya? Can't ya?" Mr. Tipton Martin began to sidle very gently in the direction of the reader's entrance, but Superintendent Mouse, moving his great bulk with surprising speed, put it between him and the wide open spaces beyond. Then he looked at Mrs. Craggs. "It's Mrs. Craggs, isn't it?" he said. "Well, just give your full name and address to one of my officers, Mrs. Craggs. I've a feeling we'll be needing you to give evidence sooner or later, and a witness who really knows what she's talking about is always a pleasure to have on hand." And from old Mr. Lacroix there came a murmured rider to that statement. "Yes," he said, almost as if he was speaking to himself, "drink deep, or taste not the Pierian spring." If you like that story, consider supporting me as a patron. That way you help me make more stories for you and get access to a patrons-only library of stories. Lots more hours for you to listen to. So that was A Dangerous Thing by H.R.F. Keating. And I know I went a bit over the top there with the accents, but I had a lot of fun. I really enjoyed that story. I thought it was really funny. So let's talk about Mr. Keating. Henry Raymond Fitzwalter Keating, known affectionately as Harry to his friends and family, was born on 31st of October, Halloween, 1926 in St Leonards-on-Sea, Sussex, right on the south coast. He wrote his first story, typed it out, at the age of 8. He went to Merchant Taylor School in London, followed by Trinity College, Dublin. In 1956, he started off as a journalist, working on the Daily Telegraph. He worked for 15 years as the crime books reviewer for the Times. Just imagine, they had a person whose job was to review crime books. That was it. Keating's influence on the world of crime fiction extended beyond his writing. He held several prestigious positions within the literary community. He was chairman of the Crime Writers Association, chairman of the Society of Authors, president of the Detection Club, and he was elected as a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. He wrote a ton of books. Keating's crime fiction, particularly his series feature Inspector Goat of Bombay CID, brought him international acclaim. His debut novel in this series, The Perfect Murder, 1964, won a Crime Writers Association Gold Dagger, and he was nominated for an Edgar Award. Keating never visited India until a decade after he started writing about it with this Indian detective, relying instead on meticulous research and imagination. Much like Bram Stoker never went to Transylvania, he just researched it in the library. So, there you go. If you fancy writing about somewhere you've never been, you can. So he wrote screenplays. He edited the essay collection Agatha Christie, First Lady of Crime. I've got a copy of that. I picked that up in a second-hand bookshop in Dingwall in the Highlands. He wrote a book about how to write crime fiction, 1986, called Writing Crime Fiction. And I've actually just realised I probably want to get that. And he received the George N. Dove Award in 1995 and the Cartier Diamond Dagger in 1996. And he continued writing well into his later years, and his last Inspector Goat novel was published in 2009, and he passed away in London in 2011, aged 84. There you go. Let's talk about this story in particular. So A Dangerous Thing was first published in 1979 as part of the anthology The Verdict of Us All, edited by Julian Simmons. This story marked the debut of Mrs. Craggs, a resourceful charwoman who's a cleaner, who unexpectedly finds herself solving crimes confounding societal expectations of gender and class. The anthology showcased a variety of crime writers, and his story is pretty innovative, isn't it? An amateur detective from a working class background with lots of humour in it. And this set the stage for a series of stories featuring Mrs. Craggs. And so he blends traditional mystery with comedy, really. I wonder if it's because crime fiction is traditionally known for twists. I didn't see that coming, and taking the reader's expectations and turning them. We see Agatha Christie does this. One of the big so there are plot twists, of course, but there are kind of convention twists as well. So you're using your audience's expectations, because we all have lazy expectations and shorthand about how things should be, what people should do, what to expect next, how people should behave, what comes next in the story. But in this case, he subverts that. He isn't the first to do that. So first of all, and American fiction is different in that, well, I'll say why in a minute. So the first subversion, if you like, I mean, people did it before she did it. And we have Miss Marple, who's a woman detective. So that's the first kind of twist. And Christie wasn't the only person who did this. And certainly, this is decades after Christie. So it's not completely startling, but still, and I suppose these days, later on in the latter part of the 20th century and the early 21st century, there are tons of female sleuths, aren't there? But that wasn't the case back in the early days, and it may have been a bit of the case in the 80s, but still it's slightly different, isn't it? The second subversion she does is much, and the American hard-boiled, again, we're talking about much earlier, so it's probably not a fair comment, but, really, Sam Spade, etc., the Continental Op, they are tough guy men. So, yeah, what the Americans did do much sooner than the British, which probably won't be any surprise if you look at the two societies, is that British detective fiction is, for most of its history, class-bound. It is the preserve of leisured, or at least people from the topper social echelons. And what Keating is doing here is turning that right round. Now, I don't know anything about Keating's politics. The fact he had a very kind of wealthy private education and went to work with the Daily Telegraph and the Times, which are conservative-leaning newspapers, doesn't say anything about it. But I would be surprised if he was making some kind of political point here. I think he's doing it because it's a fun thing to do and it subverts readers' expectations. So Mrs. Craggs is a woman, and she's working class, and she is of the servant class, isn't she? She cleans the floors. And it's almost like looking back at the big houses whereby, we have these country house stories, and the servants either don't appear at all, or if they do, they're suspects. The butler did it. And they are very much other. They're not like us. They are like me, actually, but they are not the protagonists, are they? They're not, the protagonists travel the world, are leisured, don't do very much, are wealthy, and the servants are there. Now, in this is the other way around. I think the other thing here that she does, that this story is about, now listen, I think it's a funny story. I think it's a funny, clever story, and I think that's mainly what it's about. But if we're going to kind of dig around and think about the story, then we would be talking about the female detective, a working class Miss Marple, a working class Miss Marple. That's who she is. And of course, she was such fun that he went on to write more stories about her. And her, is it Miss Milhorn, who's a sidekick, is I didn't do it like this because I didn't realise who Miss Milhorn was, but she later turns out to be a distressed gentlewoman. She's not working class. She's just cleaning because she's fallen on her uppers. Oh, she's on her uppers, which means, of course, the bottom of her shoes have worn out. Anyway. So, but the other issue here is about superficiality and what Sartre would call bad faith, really. So what we have is the proper scholars, and these are like the old geezer, Grappelin and Le Croix. And I apologise for his French accent. I apologise for the accent, except it was a lot of fun. So sorry, not sorry, I suppose. And they're proper, and she knows this. It's like I used to be a waiter years ago when I was a teenager, and I worked in this hotel in the Lake District in Cumbria, and we would have different kinds of customers coming in, and servants, or the servant class, which we were, are very snobbish. Servants who work with the privileged are very snobbish. My opinion, my observation, is just through this work. Really, I worked in a couple of hotels in different places, and what we would say, so there were the farmers, and they would come in. They had some money. They were farmers. They talked. They spoke in local dialect. They were rough and ready, but we liked them. And they were decent with us. They just treated us as their equals, and they were nice. And then there was like the established county people who would come in, and I don't know if they had any money, but they were gentle folk, and they were charming, and you were aware of a divide in your position between them and you. You weren't them. I think this was giving me this terrible deference thing I have going on that Sheila points out to me all the time. But and they were decent. They were really, really nice, and they were absolutely charming, and they didn't create a fuss, and they were nice people. And then the ones we didn't like were the ones who were brash, who threw their money around and were vulgar, and they would click their fingers. Not all of them, but some of them would. And so what I say is that she is a bit like that. She is the cleaner, but she is an acute observer, and like the waiters I was talking about, and the rest of the staff, the cleaners and things like that, domestics. We would know who of our betters, if you like. And I know you may be enraged me saying this, but this is kind of I'm talking about this 1970s, and in a very kind of away from it all part of the UK. So not it wasn't London or anything like that, or even a city. It was like a rural area where kind of old attitudes linger, I think. And you may say it's shameful and workers of the world unite and all that kind of thing. I'm just telling you what it was like. So she knows this as well as we knew who fits in. So you have the proper scholars, and they're shabby, and their glasses are smeared, and they love learning, and they just spend all the time learning. And she respects them in the same way that we respected the county people who came in. They were charming. I'm not saying everybody is. Of course I'm not. And I'm not sticking up for it either. I'm not sticking up for class divisions at all. I'm just reporting. And she is the same. And she has these people they are proper scholars. And then she has the whizzers. And the whizzers are a bit flash. They're hustlers in a sense, aren't they? What are they there for? Are they proper scholars? Do they really love learning? Or is it a means to an end? And I think that's where the bad faith comes in. They're not authentic. They are jumping. And this is a deep distaste in society. I remember when I worked somewhere else, where in a part of the government that had a lot of people from the upper echelons worked there, and we would be very judgmental about people who were ambitious, who would do things for the show, who do things in order to be seen to do them. And we were more comfortable with people who did things because that was what they did. That was their raison d'être. No, they were, if they were hardworking, it was because they were hardworking, not because. And I remember we had a guy, I won't say his name, and this was in the days where CDs were very rare. And he had I can't remember who the composer was, but this CD stayed on his, I wasn't say Berlioz, but I'm not sure it was. This CD stayed on his desk for months. And he had a copy of Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar as well, and various kind of, it wasn't detective fiction, it wasn't genre fiction, it was kind of intellectual fiction. And he would go to all the right places and the social events, and he would glad hand the right people. And it was all about him getting promoted. And I remember when he was promoted, we were that was my first observation of that in the world, because I'd been brought up thinking about merit, that you got on in the world by working hard, being decent and honest. And then in my early 20s, I'm like, oh, that's not how it works. It's about glad handing. It's about It's Machiavellian. Anyway, that's a long way from Mrs. Cragg, or is it? Because I think that's the issue about Tipton Martin. His crime is about him murdering the old boy, Grappling. It is about that. But what is that crime about? It's about inauthenticity. This man stole an idea from the brilliant younger brother, deceased in the First World War, who is nothing but heroic, portrayed as nothing but heroic and brilliant, and the old boy who he thought was dead and he thought was safely out of the way is reading the magazine, and now he knows he's going to tip him off and realise that this man is is it a shuckster or something? Anyway, he's basically a thief of ideas, and there's nothing to him but ambition and murder. So that's right, and that's his crime, and that's coded and signified in his dress and his impatience as well, and the fact when he does talk to the guard, it's Mrs. Craggs susses this. This is like, yeah, it's not right. This is not right, and she, So the other thing to say about the story is, of course, it proceeds otherwise as a detective story. So we have, and Keating knew his stuff, because his book about how to write, he was not a stupid man at all. He was a thorough, brilliant man, and he wrote his book based on his study of the genre. It wasn't just him plucking things out of idea like a blog post. He actually, it was based on his research and his thoughtfulness and his expertise and his knowledge. So he knew how to write a detective story, and it proceeds as a detective story. So what we have is, apart from all the comic characters, we have the crime, which doesn't occur till 2/3 of the way through, really. And although it's set up nicely beforehand, with Grappling coming in, and then Tipton Martin coming in, and the very first foreshadowing of the nice man, who wasn't French in those days, because I didn't know he was French, about little knowledge is a dangerous thing, because if I'd known he was French, and in fact he might not have been French, but I think he was French with a name like that, so I would have probably done a really awful accent at the beginning as well, so you were saved. Yes, so, and the clues come along, but in the tradition of classic detective stories, I don't think you as the listener, me as the reader, could have got that about the paper. I think we'd have to be very, very astute to realise that that's what the paper was for. Some people might have been. You could argue that if you were smart enough, if you were Sherlock Holmes, you would have got it, but the average person wouldn't have got it. And so we have the denouement sort of at the end. And sometimes, I mean, the old classic stuff, Sherlock Holmes and Agatha Christie, and I keep coming back to them, but Marjorie Allingham, etc., etc. A lot of the time, there is an exposition at the end whereby the detective says, and this is how it worked, and we go, oh, flipping heck, that's how it worked. Because we didn't get it. But when they explain it, we go, ha, 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 yes. But in this case, so sometimes it's explicit. I did the killing of Michael Finnegan last week, and that the denouement was implicit in that we were shown it. So we weren't told it, we were shown it. We were shown the explanation. And I think she kind of half tells us, half shows us. Mrs. Craggs half tells us and half shows us, but at the end we get the explanation about. She realises, and she then explains to Inspector Mouse. They are. So that's that really, and I think So although I think he's playing with our expectations of class and gender, whatever, not to make any serious sociological point or argue a case, but just to subvert it, in the same way he twists, he withholds information. He doesn't massively twist it. Is it a twist that it's Tipton? Maybe it is, yeah. But it's not a big twist. See what I'm saying? I think he's just playing with this, her being common and a woman as being, and I speak that as somebody who is common myself, so it's not a word of insult. And that's it. I think that's it. Anyway, so I thought it was a hilarious thing. And the thing that stood out for me, I mean, the dialogue was funny, but the characters, the comic characters were stupendous, really. Fantastic. I really enjoyed it. Anyway, sometimes, and a lot of the early, and I said this again before, often these stories are cosy, but they're about brutal murders. So if we saw that, we'd be aghast. We'd have to have therapy. But you know, it's cosy, which is weird. Well, it's not weird. We've talked about it before. We're probably not going to mention it again. But anyway, look out for the whizzers in your life. Don't trust them.